over here. All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the show Behind the Mic with Voice Like a Lion podcast, the host of which is Steven Pemberton, and he is here with us today. I think Steven started this journey pretty recently of starting a podcast and running this show, and we're really excited to talk to him and hear about his journey and his experience running his own podcast. For those of you who don't know, the Voice Like a Lion podcast, this is for business leaders who are looking to get started, and Steven will tell you more about this when we talk to him. Steven, welcome to the show. We are excited to have you here.
Arjun, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Awesome. So I'm going to jump to this. I know that you have been running this show pretty recently. You haven't started this show for, you started the show only a few months back over here. Tell me a little bit more about what it was at the beginning, right? What motivated you to launch your own show? What were you doing at that time that caused you to do this?
That's a great question. For me, what ended up inspiring this podcast was actually another podcast. So Voice Like a Lion is the first one where I've done it by myself. But I've also had another podcast that I used to do with my wife. And then we used to also do some challenges and some different virtual events. So that's what really inspired it. And then the motivation behind launching it was, in the beginning, it was to have almost a video journal and an audio journal of what I'm walking through. And what I mean by that is I've had some pretty successful businesses in the past, some pretty successful launches. And now we are launching 2 more businesses, and just walking through what that looks like. Because in the beginning, that's all it was going to be. It was going to be me talking about my thoughts for the day, my thoughts on what I'm walking through. And as I started meeting really amazing business owners, that's when I started bringing more people on board. But that was the main motivations behind launching my podcast.
Awesome. I'm excited to know that you had another podcast that was running, and you mentioned sort of cool, fun challenges. Tell me a little bit more about that. What was the entertaining and / fun part of what you were doing that inspired you to create another show?
Yeah, so that one was all about marriage. And the reason why that was so fun is because it had nothing to do with our success in business. It was simply focused on us giving back. So it was my wife and I, we took the time out of our day to make sure that we could give people the things that they need to actually have a successful marriage. And that was what made that so fun. It was for me and my wife. We both had the spotlight. We both had the time to talk to the guests, to talk to the people listening, and to get real insight on what they're walking through. And then being able to speak to that was what made it really fun. And so that was a big inspiration for when I launched Voice Like a Lion. Is I didn't just want it to be my thoughts on, well, this is what happened and this is what I'm doing. This is why I'm doing it. Because so often when I've gone to, as I like to call it, YouTube University, and I'm looking up tutorials on how to figure something out, if they say, well, you click this and then you do this and then you do that, but why am I doing that? And not understanding the why behind the actions usually leads to inaction. Because if you can't see the bigger overarching reason why you're doing it, then you're going to burn out. You're going to quit eventually.
Right. I really like that. Knowing the why behind what you're doing, that's an insightful part of it. Tell me more about when you started this. Did you have a goal in mind as to hey, I want this podcast to start driving people to my business, or I want to get so many relationships going because of this? Or was there a goal in mind, or was there something that was a a measurable target that you were working towards?
So in the beginning, no. But over the past few months, the answer has changed. So the answer is yes. So in the beginning, I mentioned it where it was more of a video audio journal. And it was letting people into my life and into what it looks like to launch a business, what it looks like to run a business. And then over time, as I started bringing more people onto the show and having guests, I realized that it's a great method of meeting people. It's a great way for me to reach people that normally I wouldn't be able to reach. And what I mean by that is I've had the opportunity to have people on my show that they manage $15 billion worth of wealth. That's a person that generally I would not be able to speak to. And the reason why I was able to is you're able to leverage a show. Now, granted, if you're listening to this and you're saying, well, Steven, I'm just starting. Well, hey, me too. I don't have a ton of downloads. And there's not a certain metric that I was able to hit to be able to get people on the show. Granted, there's going to be people who they guest on a lot of shows. And if they guest on a lot of shows, they are going to ask about those metrics. But for the majority of people, they really enjoy just telling their story, what they've been through, how they can help people, how they have helped people. And I would say that that's been the biggest goal here recently is twofold. One is how do I deepen relationships with people that I've already met in the past? And then two is how do I begin relationships with people who I would love to get in contact with?
I really like that. So you're very relationship focused, and this podcast is a way for you to sort of broaden that network of yours. I really like that. So it almost seems like you're already on the path to achieving this. What are some of the things that you're doing to further achieve this goal? Have you changed the format? Because this is again a thing that I notice many people do is like they start off in like a few weeks or a few months. They kind of find their voice. They find what the purpose of that podcast or a show is. So would you say that like you have changed things significantly since you found that calling for you?
I would say that I found a nice mix where I can still be more relational, where it's just me on an episode and I can talk about what's on my heart. And then I can also have a guest on and really build that relationship. Now, granted, I would say that now it's more, and what I mean by a happy mix is I would say the majority of it, 80%, I would say, is all catered towards that relationship. How do I build it? How do I deepen it? Right. And then the other 20% is more for me. How do I get my thoughts out there? Because as a host, most of the time, even as what you're doing right now, is you're asking questions and then you're getting insight. And usually that means that the floor is not open to you to be able to explain how you feel, what you're learning, what your insight is on that situation. And that's where I did those solo episodes. So I'm able to put out, hey, this is my thoughts on this situation.
Love it. Love it. Like mixing up formats because you actually own this. That's a fantastic concept that you talked about. Just jumping in on audience here, right? How did you go about in defining who your audience is? What would be their demographics and everything? And like, how did you come up with that?
Yeah. So my audience is all either early stage startups or they're going to be angel investors. They're going to be people who are in wealth management. And the way that all happened, or they're going to be in the faith space. So it's really that overarching, it kind of could go anywhere. But the reason why it's majority of either business or faith is that's generally what I talk about. And also I've been on close to 100 different shows now as a guest. And the people that I connect with, if they say, well, what have you done? Like, have you been on any other shows? Who have you had on your show? I'm able to give them a pretty wide portfolio of things I've done. And those people will come over, watch my show, and be able to gain their own insight and say, hey, I would love to be on it, or I would not like to be on it. And that's been the really fun part about it. And the way, again, that's how I came up with it was that those were the circles I was already in. I was already in faith circles. I was already in business circles. So that's what really defined my audience.
That's fantastic. So it almost seems like you did a little bit of like tapping into like the communities and like groups that you already were in to define your audience, because obviously you have the most expertise in that area. How do you right now reach these people? I know that the podcast is distributed through the usual podcast channels like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everything. Are there ways in which you are like tapping into these people and like reaching to them outside of this?
Yeah. So the best way that I've found to do it for me is I have done it through old shows I've been on. So if I'm on a really big show, or even if I'm not, if I'm on other shows, I will go and look at their past guest list and I will do research on these people and see would they be a good fit for my show. And then I will reach out, and it's much easier. It's more of a warm introduction where instead of me just randomly cold DMing you on LinkedIn, it's me saying, hey, we were both on the same podcast. I listened to your episode. It was incredible. I would love to connect for a 10, 15-minute virtual coffee chat and just see where it goes, whatever you want to say there. And then you get on there, you see if there's some similar energy. And if so, then you can say, then your only ask on that call is, hey, I actually would love to carry on this conversation. And I promise you it'd be 10 to 15 minutes, and we're already creeping up on that time. So I want to offer spotlighting your story on my show. Would you be open to that? And most likely these people have already been guests on other shows, so they're going to be open to being on yours too. And that's been probably the most key thing for me.
Amazing. Yeah. So yeah, I think this is the key topic that like I also want to double click on is like, you know, lining up these speakers and everybody. Like, what makes a good speaker for you? What would you say is like a quality that you look for? I know that like appearing on other podcasts or other shows is an important part of it, but also like when they have to be on your show, how would you vet them?
Yeah, so the way that I vet them is not only do I listen to their other episode, but I look at what they do. And the reason why is because if it's somebody who's selling steel and they've made a lot of money selling steel, that's amazing. And they know how to run a business. But I want to have people on my show who are truly helping people, no matter how that is. Maybe they're a TEDx speaker. Maybe they are just launching a book and I know them and I know that the concepts in the book are going to help people. I want to connect with people and I want to give a voice to people to empower other people. So that's how I vet them. And it's really about what they've done. How have you helped people? How long have you helped people? How long have you been in business? What does your business do? What have you been able to do for others? And that's how I look at those. And then even just lining them up is I want to make sure that we have some similarities as far as energy levels, because at times I can be really high energy. And then there's times where depending on the speaker, I can be a little bit more melancholy. And I want the speaker to be the same. So I want it to be an enjoyable conversation. And I think that as humans, those are the people we gravitate towards the most, are people who are more like us. And that may not mean the same skin tone or the same nationality. It's just typically energy. Is our energies, does it feel like you have the same kind of energy as me? Do we have similar energies? And if the answer is yes, then it's going to be a good conversation. Even if you don't have the same beliefs as me, it means that we can see the world through a different lens and enjoy it together.
I really like that. I've heard like some hosts talk about like conversation with the special guests as if it's like music. You need to like sort of match pace, like, you know, like play with that as you would. And like, so, and you said that well by like, you know, like sort of the balance of energy. And also like how you're almost everything that you're saying is sort of deep rooted in values like relationship, impact, and like the helpful nature that you're doing. I think that's showing off because it seems like it's a core from which your podcast has come out. So that is great. So maybe walk us through just like what is the process of producing a show? Just like some of the basics, right? Like again, our listeners are people who are like looking to launch their own show. It may not be a show about business or may not be a show about anything that has to do with technical or like money or anything at all, but there is a process to like launching a show, that everything from like inviting the speakers to like preparing to researching to like then publishing, what happens after. Just walk us through that and like what time, how long do you spend on that and everything as well?
That's a fantastic question. So what the process looks like for me is, so if you're looking at everything from, this is something that I got stuck on in the beginning, was thinking that I had to have the best technology. That's not true. You don't have to have the camera that I have now. I have a Logitech Brio. I think that it's $150 some. I have a Blue Yeti and it's $100. And Blue Yeti is an incredible mic, especially if you're just getting started. Logitech Brio has great quality, but you don't need that. You can actually start it on your phone. And I think just overcoming those initial barriers where you can have a podcast and actually interview people and it could be audio only. You don't have to be the Joe Rogan podcast and have the biggest YouTube following, right? And I think for me, when I think about process, it all starts with, if you are just now launching, or if let's say you've already launched and you're trying to figure out, well, how long should I really be spending? For me, it's the same way I look at business, is who are you helping with it? And if I take the time to think, who am I helping with it? Because the reason why my show is called Voice Like a Lion is I want to give a voice to people who are helping other people. And that's why I created the name that way. And it came from somebody else who empowered me and said that I had a voice like a lion. So because I was empowered in that way, I want to empower others. And that's the same way that I think you should think about your show, whether you're in business or health or whatever it is. It could be talking about anime or video games. Is what's the purpose of it? Are you helping people figure out how to beat the next level of Zelda? Or are you just talking about the concept of Zelda? Those are two different things. Because if you're talking about the concept and how you were able to learn from Zelda's walk, or from how Link was going through these trials, that you connected with the character, that's going to help different people. And being able to figure out that part, who are you speaking to and how are you going to speak to them? And I think that that's the most important part of my process. And afterwards, when I think of let's say the weekly process of lining up speakers and then lining them up down the road,
right,
is, I mentioned it earlier, is for me, I get on a lot of podcasts. I love being a guest on podcasts. So I'll guest on a podcast and then I will go look through. I'll do one of two things. If I love the host and I love their story, I'll just ask them, hey, would you mind being on my show? Most of the time, they're not going to say no. They're going to say, yeah, I would love to.
Right.
And so that's a way for you to line it up. You just have to have some kind of calendar. You can do it something as simple as, hey, I'm available. Tell me some dates you're available. Maybe you don't want to pay for Calendly. You can get Calendly and you can do it free. You can do a free version of Calendly. I love Calendly. Calendly is incredible. I would use that because you can just send it to them. They can pick times that works for you. It works for them. That's a practical thing that you could do. And then actually, let's say it's a few days. I always like to give myself a few days. If you know you're going to do a show on Thursday and today is Tuesday, take the time to go research that person. And don't just look at their LinkedIn. Actually go look at their website. If they don't have a website, go find their Instagram, go find their Facebook, figure out who they are, because you want to know what their values are. Do their values line up with yours? And if not, perfectly fine. It's about understanding their view of life, because when they come on the show, it'll help you cater your questions. And if you want it to be very conversational, I like to still have what I call waypoints. So I have an opening question. I'll have kind of a halfway question, and maybe I have a closing question. That way it just guides the flow of the conversation. And if I feel in the middle of the conversation that we're going in a way different direction, but I know it's helping somebody, then I will scrap it. But for me, I just like to have some kind of structure. And that process, I build those questions around what I've found about that person. Maybe it's about their personal life. Maybe it is about their business. Maybe it's about a past tragedy, whatever it looks like. And then the after show of that is I use a software called Shotcut. It's free, but super complicated. It's like Photoshop or Adobe Premiere. And on there, I'll put my video in there. I will cut it up and make sure it's as good as it can be. And then I upload it. I use Buzzsprout, and Buzzsprout will send it to all the major platforms. So I don't have to personally do that. But that's what my process looks like as far as how long it takes. I mean, per week, it's not taking me a ton of time. Maybe 4 hours, I would say, a week, maybe. And I think that's pretty much the whole encompassing of both of those questions.
Yeah, love it. I think I appreciate you going into like the details of like the nuances of this. Especially, I loved your points about like, most people is like, I want to start a show and I'm going to buy the most expensive mic possible and like everything. And like, I completely subscribe to what you just said about you don't need like a fancy mic to get started. And it's okay to get started with like some of the more basic idea of what you're going to do and then like figure it out on the flow. I like that. And then you walk me through what happens before, during, and especially like the care in which you deal with the guests that come on your show. Much appreciate that. I think that's what you said like resonates a lot. One question that came up with someone, I wanted to like post that over here, is like you share the stories of humans behind businesses, and you're a business owner yourself. How have you built more relationships via this podcast?
Yes. So that's something that we mentioned earlier. This is my favorite part of having a podcast. So there's so many different reasons why people have a podcast. You can have a podcast to build relationships, to find more clients, to just talk about whatever you want to talk about. And for me, I love this question because that's my heart. That's the way that I do business, is through relationships. And so, yes, have I built more relationships via the podcast? Most definitely. And again, this is where I was talking about even relationships that you've had. When you take somebody that you've had a relationship with and put them on the show, you're going to see, I just had a guest yesterday. who I was in his mastermind. I've been on his podcast. I've had multiple calls with him. And on this podcast, in 30 minutes, I learned more about him than I had learned the entire time.
Mm-hmm.
Because when he had the spotlight on him, he was able to expose more about his walk, what he's gone through, what has helped him be successful. And that's important because it's the humans behind the businesses, even as this person was saying.
I love it. I think this is great. Like the you almost try to like bring out a very like the raw side of a person, and not in a negative way, but in like in a way that like you know them now way more personally than you could have ever. That's actually a very, very insightful point. One last question, and this is from me, is around like, there are going to be like, sometimes like it feels like a thankless journey and like, hey, why should I be running this podcast and everything? I know you're early stages and it's probably still in the honeymoon phase of it or so, but like, what keeps you motivated? Like, are there moments or stories that make you feel like, you know what, that's why I do this. And like, that's why I would keep doing this.
So what's interesting is this podcast, I've been doing it for, I would say the last 8 months. And with it was probably the third episode that I put up. It was, I maybe had 4 downloads. It was not very many. And I had somebody message me on Instagram and they told me how that podcast episode impacted their life and that they were changing how they looked at the world and how they were handling their finances because of something that my mom and I share, because I have my mom on my show. And that wasn't the reason why I keep going. And I think that it's also about understanding why you got started. And this is the same thing I talk to entrepreneurs and business owners about, is when they get to the point where they just want to quit, is asking yourself the question, why did I start? And if you started to make money with the podcast and maybe you're 8 months, 9 months, 10 months, a year down the road and you haven't made anything yet, then I can understand how you feel that way. And for me, it wasn't like that. I want to give a voice to people who either A, they don't have a voice, or B, is they have a voice and they're empowering other voices. And so it's easy for me to keep that motivation when I find the right people that fit that mold.
Love it. I think that's a very powerful moment to hear from somebody saying, because that's essentially what you run a show for, is to create that impact. And when you hear it from people that like it had that impact that you actually desired, priceless. I love it. And I also I think the subtle point that you made, I want to like double click on that about like how this is not like an instant gratification thing. And like you start thinking about this as like, I need to get like $10,000 by this in the month, by end of month 2 or so. This is not a thing for you. And I tell this to a lot of people, is to like, they're like thinking about the ROI of the podcast in the initial stages. I think you said it well about like how there's like a patience to this and like how it grows over time. Love it. That's kind of the questions that I had for you. Again, Steven, thank you so much for being on the show. I learned a ton having you on the show. Again, as you had an experience with that, like I'm feeling the same thing over here. It was a great moment having you on this show and talking to you about your journey.
Yes, Arjun, thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Thanks.